societies conventionally identified as Viking Age Scandinavians emerged from a specific northern European environment, shaped by geography, climate, and long-term human adaptation. The Scandinavian peninsula and adjacent regions of present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden are characterized by fragmented coastlines, extensive archipelagos, dense forests, limited arable land, and long winters. These environmental conditions influenced settlement dispersion, subsistence strategies, and mobility patterns well before the period traditionally dated from the late 8th to the mid-11th century. Archaeological evidence demonstrates continuous habitation in Scandinavia since the late Paleolithic, with gradual developments in agriculture, metallurgy, and maritime technology during the Bronze and Iron Ages. By the early first millennium CE, regional societies had developed complex local identities, trade connections across the Baltic and North Sea, and social hierarchies rooted in landholding and kinship. The period later labeled the Viking Age did not arise abruptly, but represented an intensification of existing patterns of seafaring, exchange, and political consolidation. Its historical significance lies not in sudden innovation, but in the scale and reach of Scandinavian interaction with wider European, Eurasian, and North Atlantic worlds. These interactions left a durable imprint on settlement patterns, languages, political institutions, and historical memory across multiple regions. The Northern European region, later identified as Scandinavia, consists of a set of physical environments whose characteristics shaped patterns of human settlement over long periods. Denmark occupies the southern margin of this region and is defined primarily by low relief, glacially formed soils, and broad coastal access. These conditions supported relatively stable agricultural regimes from the late prehistoric period onward. Arable land was more continuously available, allowing cereal cultivation, animal husbandry, and denser settlement than was possible farther north. In contrast, the Scandinavian peninsula presents far greater environmental fragmentation. Norway is dominated by mountain chains, narrow valleys, and deeply incised fjords that limit cultivable land to thin coastal strips and isolated inland pockets. Sweden combines extensive forest zones with inland lakes and river systems, while southern and eastern areas contain plains more suitable for farming. The legacy of repeated glaciations during the Pleistocene profoundly altered the Scandinavian landscape. Retreating ice sheets carved valleys, deposited moraines, reshaped coastlines, and redistributed soils across the region. As a result, soil depth and fertility varied sharply even within small areas. In much of Norway and central Sweden, soils remained thin and rocky, constraining agricultural productivity. These limitations did not prevent settlement, but required flexible subsistence strategies that combined cultivation with pastoralism, fishing, hunting, and resource extraction. Environmental variability encouraged localized adaptation rather than uniform economic practice. Climate constituted an additional structural factor influencing early Scandinavian societies. The region experiences pronounced seasonal variation in daylight, with extended summer illumination and prolonged winter darkness. These cycles shaped agricultural rhythms, labor organization, and food storage practices. Short growing seasons limited the range of viable crops and increased vulnerability to climatic fluctuation. Periods of cooling or increased precipitation could significantly affect yields, particularly in marginal zones. Long winters reinforced the importance of stored surplus and durable housing, while summer months concentrated agricultural labor into brief intervals of intensive activity. Temperature extremes and seasonal instability influenced settlement permanence and density. Communities tended to cluster where environmental conditions were most predictable, such as fertile lowlands or sheltered coastal areas. In more marginal environments, settlement continuity depended on careful management of land and resources over generations. Environmental knowledge was transmitted within households and kin groups, guiding decisions regarding crop selection, grazing rotation, and seasonal movement. These practices reduced risk, but did not eliminate exposure to environmental stress. The distribution of arable land directly shaped population patterns. Denmark and parts of southern Sweden supported relatively higher population densities due to continuous cultivable terrain. Elsewhere, especially in Norway, settlements were more dispersed, reflecting the patchwork availability of usable land. This dispersion limited large-scale aggregation and encouraged local self-sufficiency. Overland travel across rugged terrain was difficult, reinforcing the importance of waterways as connective routes between communities. Environmental constraints did not function in isolation, but interacted with social organization. Household viability depended on access to sufficient land to sustain both crops and livestock. The need to preserve workable farm units influenced inheritance practices and discouraged excessive land division. Over time, environmental limits became embedded in social norms governing land use and settlement continuity. These norms contributed to regional variation without producing complete isolation between Scandinavian communities. Taken together, geography, climate, and glacial history established the foundational conditions under which early Scandinavian societies developed. These factors shaped where people lived, how they produced food, and how they organized labor across seasons. While environmental conditions did not determine historical outcomes, they consistently framed the range of feasible economic and social strategies available to human populations in Scandinavia. Within this setting, long-term adaptation favored continuity rather than rapid transformation. Settlement choices reflected accumulated experience with local soils, winds, and water access. Minor shifts in shoreline position and forest cover altered available resources gradually, allowing incremental adjustment rather than displacement. Environmental knowledge therefore functioned as inherited capital, shaping expectations and limiting experimentation. These conditions produce stability alongside constraint, anchoring communities to specific landscapes across centuries. The resulting patterns of residence and resource use formed the underlying framework upon which later political, economic, and cultural developments were constructed. This framework persisted despite environmental fluctuation, reinforcing regional distinctiveness while maintaining shared adaptive principles across the Scandinavian world during the early historical period itself. The organization of settlement in early Scandinavia reflected the uneven distribution of arable land and pasture across the region. In areas where cultivable soil was continuous, particularly in Denmark and portions of southern Sweden, settlements tended to form clustered villages. These groupings consisted of multiple households situated near shared fields, meadows, and grazing areas. Such arrangements facilitated coordinated agricultural activity, including plowing schedules, crop rotation, and livestock management. Communal regulation of land use emerged gradually in these environments, as proximity required negotiated access to shared resources. The physical landscape thus supported denser habitation and more frequent interaction among neighboring households. In contrast, much of Norway's terrain favored dispersed settlement. Arable land was often confined to narrow coastal strips, river valleys, or isolated basins between mountain ranges. Farms were commonly separated by significant distances, sometimes accessible only by water or difficult overland routes. This dispersion reinforced household autonomy and limited sustained daily interaction beyond immediate kin networks. While social ties extended across regions, environmental separation shaped the scale and frequency of contact. Local governance and cooperation therefore operated within smaller spatial units than in lowland regions. Pastoral resources played a central role in shaping land use across Scandinavia. Livestock provided meat, dairy products, hides, and labor, making access to grazing land essential for household survival. Seasonal movement of animals between lowland farms and upland pastures developed as a response to limited arable land. In mountainous and forested regions, summer grazing in higher elevations reduced pressure on cultivated fields and allowed recovery of lowland pastures. This pattern required careful coordination of labor and reinforced seasonal rhythms within rural economies. Winter fodder production and storage became critical determinants of herd size and long-term sustainability. Forests occupied extensive portions of Scandinavia and represented both opportunity and constraint. Woodland resources supplied timber for building construction, fuel for heating and craft production, and raw materials for tools and transport equipment. Forests also supported hunting and gathering activities that supplemented agricultural output. However, clearing forest for cultivation demanded sustained labor investment, and soil fertility in cleared areas often declined rapidly. Communities therefore balanced expansion against the risk of land exhaustion. Forest management practices evolved incrementally, shaped by accumulated local experience rather than formal planning. Water systems structured movement and communication within this fragmented landscape. Rivers, lakes, and coastal waters functioned as primary transportation corridors, particularly where overland routes were obstructed by terrain. In Sweden, inland waterways connected forested interiors to Baltic coastal zones, facilitating exchange of goods and seasonal mobility. In Norway, fjords provided sheltered maritime routes linking isolated settlements along the coast. These water networks reduced the effective distance between communities and supported regional interaction long before sustained overseas activity developed. Access to water also influenced settlement placement. Farms and villages were commonly situated near navigable waterways to facilitate transport of goods and livestock. Fishing resources contributed significantly to subsistence, particularly in coastal regions where marine productivity offset agricultural limitations. Seasonal fishing cycles complemented agricultural rhythms, diversifying food supply and reducing vulnerability to crop failure. The integration of land and water resources produced mixed economies adapted to environmental variability. Environmental differentiation contributed to regional variation in social organization without creating cultural fragmentation. While settlement density, landholding patterns, and resource emphasis differed, shared adaptive principles linked Scandinavian communities across space. The need to manage limited arable land, coordinate seasonal labor, and maintain long-term household viability produced comparable responses to environmental constraint. These responses were expressed through locally specific practices shaped by geography, but grounded in common economic foundations. Over time, environmental management practices became embedded in customary norms governing land use, inheritance, and settlement continuity. Decisions regarding farm placement, field expansion, and pasture access reflected collective memory of environmental risk and opportunity. Such norms promoted stability and reduced conflict in resource-limited settings. The landscape, therefore, functioned not only as a physical backdrop, but as an active element in shaping social behavior and institutional development. These environmentally grounded patterns persisted across generations, providing continuity amid gradual change and forming a stable platform for subsequent historical processes. The maritime orientation of early Scandinavian societies developed gradually as a practical response to environmental conditions rather than as a singular cultural preference. Extensive coastlines, deeply indented by bays, fjords, and inlets, provided abundant access to sheltered waters. In many regions, particularly along the Norwegian coast and throughout the Danish archipelago, maritime routes offered more efficient communication than overland travel. Dense forests, mountainous terrain, and wetlands often made land routes slow and unreliable. Waterways, by contrast, allowed movement of people, livestock, and goods with comparatively lower energy expenditure. Over generations, familiarity with coastal and riverine environments produced navigational knowledge embedded within daily economic activity. Fishing formed a consistent supplement to agricultural production. Coastal waters and inland lakes supported seasonal fisheries that contributed protein and preserved food supplies. Dried and smoked fish could be stored for extended periods, reducing vulnerability during years of poor harvest. In regions with limited arable land, fishing assumed greater importance within subsistence strategies. This reliance did not replace agriculture, but diversified food sources, spreading risk across multiple ecological zones. The predictability of seasonal fish migrations allowed integration into annual labor cycles without requiring permanent relocation. Shipbuilding traditions emerged incrementally from earlier watercraft technologies adapted to local conditions. Access to timber was critical in this process. Southern Scandinavia possessed oak suitable for sturdy hull construction, while pine and fir in northern regions supported lighter vessels. Forest proximity reduced material transport costs and encouraged experimentation with hull shapes and propulsion methods. These developments were cumulative, shaped by trial, error, and environmental feedback rather than centralized planning. Vessels initially designed for local transport gradually increased in range as navigational experience expanded. Scandinavia's position between the Baltic Sea and the North Atlantic placed its populations within overlapping ecological and economic zones. The Baltic connected Scandinavian communities to eastern river systems extending deep into the European interior. The North Sea linked them to continental Europe and the British Isles. These maritime spaces were structured by seasonal winds, currents, and weather patterns that required careful observation and adaptation. Environmental knowledge, including understanding of tides and prevailing winds, reduced uncertainty and enabled routine travel within defined limits. Such familiarity transformed surrounding seas from barriers into connective environments. Despite these opportunities, environmental constraints continued to impose limits on expansion and population growth. Agricultural productivity remained modest across much of Scandinavia, particularly in upland and northern areas. Short growing seasons restricted surplus generation, while soil exhaustion threatened long-term viability if land was overused. These constraints influenced demographic stability and encouraged careful regulation of land inheritance. Maintaining economically viable farm units required restricting subdivision, reinforcing continuity of settlement rather than rapid population increase. Environmental pressure also shaped household composition and labor allocation. Families balanced agricultural work with fishing, forestry, and craft production to sustain themselves across seasonal cycles. Labor demands fluctuated throughout the year, with intense summer activity followed by winter maintenance and production tasks. These rhythms structured social life and reinforced dependence on predictable environmental patterns. Disruption to these patterns, whether through climatic fluctuation or resource depletion, carried significant consequences for household stability. Scandinavian societies therefore developed within a narrow margin between opportunity and constraint. Environmental conditions offered access to diverse resources while limiting the scale of exploitation. Adaptation emphasized resilience and continuity rather than maximal expansion. Knowledge of local landscapes accumulated over generations, guiding settlement decisions and economic practices. This knowledge was transmitted informally through experience and custom, embedding environmental awareness within social organization. By the early historical period, the interaction between geography, climate, and human adaptation had produced durable patterns of settlement and resource use. These patterns did not determine later historical developments, but defined the conditions under which change occurred. Environmental constraints framed economic choices, social organization, and mobility long before intensified interaction with external regions. The foundations established by geography and environment thus formed a stable baseline, shaping subsequent transformations without predetermining their specific outcomes. The linguistic history of early Scandinavian societies is situated within the broader development of the Germanic language family. Germanic languages emerged as a distinct branch of the Indo-European linguistic group during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. By the first centuries of the Common Era, this branch had diversified into several regional groupings, commonly classified as East, West, and North Germanic. The languages spoken in Scandinavia belong to the North Germanic subgroup, which developed through gradual divergence rather than abrupt separation. This process unfolded over several centuries and reflected sustained interaction among speech communities across the Scandinavian region. Early North Germanic developed from a shared Proto-Germanic linguistic base. Sound changes, vocabulary shifts, and grammatical developments accumulated incrementally, producing regional variation while maintaining mutual intelligibility. Linguistic reconstruction relies on comparative analysis of later written sources and fragmentary early evidence. The earliest direct attestations of North Germanic speech appear in runic inscriptions dating from the 2nd to 8th centuries CE. These inscriptions, carved on stone, metal, wood, and bone, provide limited but valuable insight into phonology, morphology, and naming practices. The runic system itself represents an adaptation of Mediterranean alphabets, likely influenced by contact with Roman material culture. The earliest runic script, known as the Elder Futhark, consisted of 24 characters and was used across much of northern Europe. In Scandinavia, runic inscriptions were typically short and formulaic, often recording personal names, ownership claims, or commemorative statements. While the content is restricted, linguistic analysis of these inscriptions reveals consistent structural features that distinguish North Germanic from contemporary West Germanic forms. Regional variation within early Scandinavian speech communities is observable through differences in rune forms, spelling conventions, and lexical choices. These variations suggest the existence of localized dialects rather than a uniform spoken language. However, shared structural features indicate ongoing communication across regions. Maritime connectivity and seasonal movement facilitated linguistic continuity despite geographic fragmentation. Language thus functioned as both a marker of regional identity and a medium of broader cultural cohesion. Ethnographic classifications applied to early Scandinavians derive largely from external observers rather than internal self-definition. Roman authors such as Tacitus described northern populations using generalized categories that reflected limited direct knowledge. Terms such as Sueans or Germani grouped diverse communities under broad labels shaped by Roman administrative and conceptual frameworks. These classifications prioritized perceived political organization, military capacity, and geographic location rather than linguistic or cultural nuance. Early medieval writers continued this practice, often adapting classical terminology to new contexts. Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and Byzantine sources applied names that emphasized difference and otherness, sometimes conflating distinct groups. Such labels do not necessarily correspond to internally recognized identities. Instead, they reflect the priorities and limitations of external documentation. Modern interpretation, therefore, requires critical assessment of these sources, distinguishing descriptive observation from rhetorical convention. Internal social identity in early Scandinavia was more closely tied to kinship, locality, and legal affiliation than to broad ethnonyms. Language played a central role in maintaining these identities by enabling participation in customary law, oral tradition, and communal assemblies. Shared linguistic features facilitated dispute resolution, inheritance regulation, and alliance formation. Naming conventions, including patronymics and descriptive epithets, reinforced lineage connections and social positioning. The gradual consolidation of North Germanic linguistic features provided a foundation for later developments in law and governance. Legal terminology preserved in later medieval texts reflects older linguistic layers that likely originated in oral tradition. These terms structured concepts of property, obligation, and authority. Language, therefore, functioned not merely as a communicative tool, but as an organizing framework for social life. Through shared speech practices, early Scandinavian communities maintained continuity across space and time, even as regional variation persisted within the broader linguistic landscape. The evolution of North Germanic speech communities occurred alongside broader patterns of social differentiation and regional interaction. While linguistic continuity existed across Scandinavia, variations in pronunciation, vocabulary, and expression reflected localized environments and social networks. These differences were not rigid boundaries, but gradual shifts shaped by settlement density, mobility, and contact routes. Coastal regions, with frequent maritime interaction, tended to exhibit greater linguistic convergence, while inland and upland areas preserved more conservative speech patterns. Such variation is consistent with societies characterized by oral transmission and limited formal standardization. Runic inscriptions provide the primary contemporary linguistic evidence for this period, but their interpretive limits must be emphasized. The brevity of inscriptions restricts insight into syntax and narrative expression. Nevertheless, personal names recorded in runic texts offer important evidence of shared linguistic structure and cultural practice. Naming conventions reveal common morphological elements and the widespread use of compound names combining semantic elements related to ancestry, animals, weapons, or abstract qualities. These patterns suggest a shared cultural vocabulary that transcended local dialects while allowing individual expression within recognized forms. The transition from the Elder Futhark to later runic systems reflects both linguistic change and shifting social conditions. By the late 8th century, the reduction of rune characters corresponded with phonological developments within North Germanic speech. This simplification indicates adaptation to evolving spoken language rather than decline in literacy. The persistence of runic writing demonstrates the continued importance of written symbols in marking identity, ownership, and memory, even within predominantly oral societies. Literacy in this context was functional and situational rather than institutional. Ethnographic descriptions from external sources provide an additional layer of classification, but must be approached critically. Roman and early medieval authors categorized northern populations according to their own political and intellectual frameworks. Geographic distance and limited direct contact resulted in generalized portrayals that emphasized exoticism or perceived martial qualities. These descriptions often lacked internal differentiation and obscured local distinctions. Terms applied to Scandinavian groups could shift in meaning depending on context, further complicating interpretation. External ethnonyms did not necessarily reflect how Scandinavian communities understood themselves. Internal identity formation was rooted in kin groups, local territories, and legal affiliation. Assemblies, known in later sources as things, functioned as focal points for collective decision-making and reinforced shared linguistic norms. Participation in these assemblies required mutual intelligibility and familiarity with customary legal language. Language thus served as a practical tool for governance and social regulation, rather than as an abstract marker of ethnicity. Interaction with neighboring populations introduced additional linguistic influences. Trade, migration, and intermittent conflict brought Scandinavian speakers into contact with speakers of West Germanic, Finnic, Slavic, and Celtic languages. Loanwords entered North Germanic vocabulary through these interactions, particularly in domains related to trade goods, administration, and material culture. Such borrowing reflects sustained contact rather than isolated encounters. Linguistic exchange occurred unevenly, with coastal and trade-oriented regions exhibiting greater lexical diversity. Despite external influences, core grammatical structures remained stable, indicating strong internal continuity. Oral transmission of law, genealogy, and customary knowledge reinforced linguistic cohesion. Poetic forms, though preserved in later written sources, likely existed in oral form during this period and contributed to standardization of vocabulary and meter. These forms required shared linguistic conventions to function effectively, further promoting coherence across regions. Language also intersected with social hierarchy. Certain terms denoted status distinctions, obligations, and rights, embedding social order within linguistic practice. Mastery of legal and formal speech conferred authority within assemblies and negotiations. Linguistic competence therefore had practical implications for participation in communal life. Over time, these practices reinforced a shared cultural framework, grounded in speech, law, and memory, rather than centralized political identity. Through gradual differentiation and sustained interaction, North Germanic language developed as both a unifying and distinguishing feature of early Scandinavian societies. Linguistic variation reflected environmental and social diversity, while shared structures supported communication and cooperation across regions. This balance between unity and diversity formed a stable foundation for later historical developments without implying uniform identity or centralized authority. The formation of collective identity in early Scandinavia cannot be separated from the slow crystallization of shared linguistic and cultural markers. While external observers applied broad ethnographic labels, internal cohesion developed through everyday practices of communication, law, and social interaction. Language operated as a unifying medium that allowed individuals from different regions to participate in common institutions despite environmental and economic variation. This cohesion was not expressed through a single political identity, but through overlapping networks of speech, custom, and legal understanding. Legal language occupied a central position within this framework. Although written law codes appear later, their terminology preserves older linguistic structures that originated in oral tradition. Words relating to property ownership, compensation, obligation, and kinship reflect shared conceptual categories across Scandinavia. These terms structured dispute resolution and social negotiation within assemblies and local courts. Consistency in legal vocabulary facilitated mutual recognition of norms even in the absence of centralized authority. Language thus functioned as an instrument of continuity, stabilizing expectations across generations. Ethnographic identity was shaped internally through affiliation with kin groups, local territories, and ritual communities. Personal identification relied on lineage, expressed through patronymic naming conventions that embedded ancestry within individual names. Such naming practices reinforced social memory and clarified relational obligations. Descriptive epithets further distinguished individuals within communities while remaining intelligible across regions. These conventions depended on shared linguistic understanding and contributed to a sense of familiarity among otherwise dispersed populations. External classification, by contrast, often emphasized difference rather than internal structure. Roman and early medieval authors framed Scandinavian groups in relation to imperial borders and political interests. Descriptions prioritized military reputation, geographic placement, or perceived customs that deviated from classical norms. These accounts frequently collapsed internal diversity into simplified categories. While valuable as historical sources, they reflect the perspectives and limitations of their authors rather than the self-conception of Scandinavian communities. As interaction with neighboring societies increased, linguistic boundaries became zones of exchange rather than rigid divisions. Scandinavian speakers encountered Finnic populations in the north and east, Slavic groups along the southern Baltic, and Germanic speakers to the south and west. These encounters produced bilingual individuals and facilitated the transfer of terminology related to trade, navigation, and administration. Borrowed words were integrated into existing linguistic frameworks, demonstrating adaptability without structural disruption. Such exchanges highlight the permeability of linguistic boundaries in practice. Oral tradition reinforced linguistic continuity across space and time. Genealogies, legal precedents, and cultural narratives were preserved through repeated performance rather than textual fixation. Accuracy depended on shared linguistic norms and mnemonic structure. This reliance on orality favored stability in core vocabulary and grammatical patterns while allowing variation in expression. The absence of formal standardization did not result in fragmentation, but maintained a balance between local specificity and regional intelligibility. Language also mediated social hierarchy and authority. Individuals skilled in formal speech, legal argumentation, or ritual expression held influence within assemblies and negotiations. Such competence required mastery of established linguistic forms and conventions. Authority therefore rested partly on linguistic performance, reinforcing the role of shared language in maintaining social order. This dynamic operated independently of centralized institutions, and persisted across regional contexts. At the late pre-Viking period, the convergence of linguistic practice, naming conventions, and legal terminology had produced a recognizable North Germanic cultural sphere. This sphere was defined less by ethnicity in a modern sense than by participation in shared communicative systems. Language enabled cooperation, regulated conflict, and preserved collective memory. These functions provided a stable foundation for interaction both within Scandinavia and with external populations. The linguistic and ethnographic patterns established during this period framed subsequent historical developments without imposing uniform identity or political unity. The archaeological record constitutes the primary source of evidence for reconstructing early Scandinavian societies prior to sustained written documentation. Material remains provide insight into settlement organization, economic activity, social differentiation, and patterns of interaction across regions. Archaeology does not present a continuous narrative, but rather a fragmented record shaped by preservation conditions, recovery methods, and interpretive frameworks. Within these limits, it offers essential information about daily life and long-term structural change from the late Iron Age into the period later identified as the Viking Age. Settlement archaeology reveals considerable variation in domestic architecture and spatial organization. Longhouses formed the dominant residential structure across much of Scandinavia. These elongated buildings housed both humans and livestock under a single roof, reflecting integrated agrarian economies. Construction techniques varied regionally, influenced by available materials such as timber, turf, and stone. Floor plans suggest multifunctional use of space, with areas designated for habitation, storage, and animal shelter. The size and complexity of longhouses differed, indicating variation in household wealth and social status. Excavated farmsteads demonstrate continuity of occupation over extended periods, often spanning multiple generations. Rebuilding on the same site suggests attachment to land and accumulated investment in local resources. Surrounding features such as field systems, fences, and outbuildings indicate planned land use rather than transient occupation. In some regions, particularly Denmark and southern Sweden, clustered settlements with multiple longhouses suggest coordinated agricultural activity and shared infrastructure. Elsewhere, isolated farms dominate the archaeological landscape, reflecting environmental constraints and localized land availability. Material culture associated with daily life includes tools, implements, and domestic goods recovered from habitation sites. Iron agricultural tools such as plowshares, sickles, and axes attest to mixed farming economies. Craft production is evidenced by remains of textile tools, woodworking debris, and metalworking installations. These finds indicate household-level production supplemented by specialized craftsmanship in certain settlements. Access to iron resources and charcoal production shaped the distribution of metalworking activity, often concentrating it near forested areas. Burial evidence provides additional insight into social differentiation and cultural practice. Graves range from simple inhumations to elaborate ship burials accompanied by weapons, jewelry, and imported goods. Variation in burial assemblages reflects differences in status, occupation, and regional custom. The presence of weapons in some graves suggests the social significance of martial roles, though not all individuals were buried with such items. Grave goods also include everyday objects, emphasizing continuity between life and commemorative practice. Hoards of precious metals, particularly silver, represent another important category of material evidence. These deposits often consist of cut silver, coins, and ornaments buried intentionally. Interpretation varies, with hoards understood as stored wealth, ritual offerings, or responses to insecurity. The geographic distribution of hoards indicates participation in long-distance exchange networks and access to external sources of silver. Coins originating from Islamic, Carolingian, and Anglo-Saxon contexts demonstrate the breadth of Scandinavian trade connections. Archaeological cultures are defined through patterns in material remains rather than explicit self-identification. Typologies of artifacts, such as brooches or weapon styles, allow scholars to trace regional variation and chronological change. These patterns do not imply rigid cultural boundaries, but reflect shared techniques and aesthetic preferences circulating through exchange and imitation. Material similarities across Scandinavia indicate sustained interaction despite environmental fragmentation. Interpretation of archaeological evidence requires caution. Preservation bias favors durable materials, while organic remains are often lost. Excavation samples represent only a fraction of past activity. Despite these limitations, the archaeological record establishes a material foundation for understanding early Scandinavian societies. It reveals economies rooted in agriculture and craft production, social differentiation expressed through architecture and burial, and connectivity extending beyond local environments. These material patterns form the basis for further analysis of social organization and external interaction. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia also reveals patterns of regional specialization and economic differentiation that developed over time. While subsistence agriculture formed the foundation of most communities, certain areas exhibit concentrations of craft activity that exceed household needs. Sites with evidence of sustained metalworking, textile production, or ship construction suggest the emergence of specialized labor within otherwise agrarian societies. These activities were not isolated from farming, but integrated into seasonal labor cycles, allowing households or local elites to coordinate production beyond immediate subsistence. Metalworking occupies a particularly prominent place in the archaeological record. Iron production relied on access to bog iron deposits, charcoal, and skilled labor. Smelting sites, slag deposits, and smithing tools indicate that iron was produced locally in many regions rather than imported as finished goods. Weapons, tools, and fittings recovered from settlements and grave demonstrate standardized forms alongside regional variation. This combination suggests shared technical knowledge circulating through networks of exchange and apprenticeship. Control over metal production may have enhanced the status of certain households or individuals, particularly those able to supply weapons or tools to others. Textile production is attested through loom weights, spindle whorls, and fabric fragments preserved in burial contexts. Wool processing and weaving required sustained labor investment and technical skill. Textiles served both practical and symbolic functions, providing clothing, sale material, and trade goods. Variation in textile quality and decoration suggests differences in access to resources and labor. In some burial contexts, finely woven garments accompany high-status individuals, indicating the role of textiles in expressing social differentiation. Evidence of shipbuilding is indirect but significant. Rivets, woodworking tools, and preserved ship remains demonstrate advanced carpentry skills and standardized construction techniques. The distribution of such evidence aligns closely with coastal and riverine environments, reinforcing the link between geography and material practice. Ship construction required coordinated labor and access to quality timber, suggesting organization beyond individual households. These activities likely operated within local networks rather than centralized institutions, reflecting flexible social arrangements adapted to environmental conditions. Trade and exchange are central themes within the archaeological record. Imported goods, including glass beads, ceramics, and coins, appear in Scandinavian contexts from the late Iron Age onward. Such items are unevenly distributed, with higher concentrations in coastal settlements and central places. These sites functioned as nodes of exchange where goods, information, and people converged. Archaeological identification of central places relies on artifact density, craft evidence, and spatial organization rather than explicit designation. Their emergence indicates increasing integration of Scandinavian communities into broader exchange networks. Burial practices continued to evolve alongside these economic changes. Monumental grave, including mounds and ship burials, required substantial labor investment and served as visible markers of status and memory. Their placement within the landscape suggests deliberate positioning to assert claims over land and lineage. Grave goods increasingly reflect access to imported materials and specialized craftsmanship, reinforcing social differentiation. However, variation persists, and many individuals were buried without elaborate display, indicating that hierarchical expression was selective rather than universal. Chronological analysis of material culture reveals gradual transformation rather than abrupt change. Artifact styles shift over time, reflecting evolving aesthetic preferences and technological refinement. These shifts provide a relative dating framework that allows reconstruction of sequence and duration. The absence of uniform change across regions underscores the decentralized nature of Scandinavian societies. Local trajectories interacted with broader trends without complete synchronization. Archaeology therefore reveals a complex material world shaped by environment, economy, and social negotiation. Production, exchange, and display operated within flexible frameworks adapted to regional conditions. Material evidence documents increasing connectivity and differentiation while preserving signs of continuity rooted in earlier practices. These patterns illuminate the lived experience of early Scandinavian communities and establish the empirical basis for interpreting social and political organization. The interpretation of archaeological material from early Scandinavia requires careful consideration of context, chronology, and methodological limitation. Material remains do not record intention or belief directly, but reflect patterns of use, disposal, and preservation shaped by both human behavior and environmental conditions. Organic materials such as wood, leather, and textiles are underrepresented due to decomposition, while stone, metal, and ceramics survive disproportionately. This imbalance influences reconstructions of daily life and economic emphasis, requiring cautious correlation between surviving artifacts and broader social practice. Regional archaeological sequences demonstrate that cultural change occurred unevenly across Scandinavia. While certain artifact types appear widely distributed, their adoption and modification followed local trajectories. Brooch styles, weapon forms, and decorative motifs often display shared origins but diverge through regional adaptation. These variations reflect localized aesthetic preferences and workshop traditions rather than rigid cultural boundaries. Exchange networks facilitated the circulation of styles and techniques, but replication involved selective adoption shaped by local social contexts. Central places identified through archaeology illustrate the aggregation of economic and social functions without centralized urban development. Sites characterized by dense artifact assemblages, craft debris, and evidence of repeated assembly suggest focal points for trade, production, and legal activity. These locations did not necessarily support permanent large populations, but functioned as periodic gathering spaces. Their emergence reflects increasing coordination across regions rather than hierarchical state formation. Environmental accessibility, particularly proximity to waterways, played a decisive role in their placement. Ritual deposition represents another dimension of material evidence. Objects placed deliberately in wetlands, rivers, or other liminal environments indicate practices that extended beyond utilitarian disposal. Weapons, tools, and personal ornaments recovered from such contexts suggest structured acts rather than accidental loss. Interpretation varies, with explanations ranging from offerings to symbolic acts associated with social transition or conflict resolution. While the meanings of these deposits remain debated, their recurrence across regions indicates shared conceptual frameworks expressed materially. Chronological frameworks developed through typology and stratigraphy allow reconstruction of long-term trends. The gradual refinement of tools and weapons reflects both technological learning and shifting social priorities. Increased standardization in certain artifact categories suggests intensified interaction and shared expectations of form and function. At the same time, continued diversity indicates that innovations spread through networks rather than directives. These patterns underscore the decentralized nature of Scandinavian societies, during this period. The archaeological record also documents continuity across generations. Reuse of burial sites, rebuilding of farmsteads, and maintenance of field systems demonstrate attachment to place and inherited claims to land. Such continuity reinforced social memory and lineage identity. Material investment in specific locations served to legitimize occupation and transmit status. Archaeology thus provides insight into how physical space was used to anchor social relationships over time. Despite its limitations, archaeology remains indispensable for understanding early Scandinavian societies. It reveals material conditions of life, economic organization, and patterns of interaction that written sources either omit or distort. By integrating settlement evidence, production remains, burial practices, and exchange goods, a composite picture emerges of societies grounded in agrarian stability, yet increasingly connected through material networks. These findings establish the empirical foundation upon which interpretations of social organization, belief, and political development must rest. Early Scandinavian social organization developed within the constraints of agrarian economies and dispersed settlement patterns. The basic social unit was the household, which functioned as both an economic and social entity. Households typically consisted of an extended family group, including multiple generations, whose members cooperated in agricultural production, animal husbandry, and resource management. The household controlled land, tools, livestock, and labor, and its continuity over time depended on maintaining sufficient resources to support all members. Social identity and security were therefore closely tied to household membership rather than to abstract political structures. Kinship formed the primary framework through which social relations were structured. Descent was generally traced through recognized family lines, and kin networks extended beyond the immediate household to include relatives across neighboring farms and settlements. These networks provided mutual support in labor-intensive tasks, dispute mediation, and defense. Kinship obligations were reciprocal and reinforced through regular interaction, shared ritual practices, and collective memory of ancestry. Loyalty to kin was a central organizing principle and often took precedence over broader affiliations. Within this structure, distinctions of legal and social status were clearly defined. Free farmers constituted the core of Scandinavian agrarian society. They owned or controlled land, participated in local assemblies, and possessed recognized legal rights. Their status was tied to their ability to sustain an independent household and contribute to communal obligations. Free farmers formed the majority population in most regions and served as the primary participants in political and legal processes at the local level. Alongside free farmers existed dependent individuals whose legal and economic autonomy was limited. These included tenants, landless laborers, and individuals attached to larger households through service obligations. Their position varied regionally and could change over time, but they generally lacked full participation in assemblies and had restricted rights in legal disputes. Dependents contributed labor in exchange for protection and access to resources, reinforcing hierarchical relationships within agrarian communities. Enslaved individuals occupied the lowest status tier. Enslavement resulted from warfare, raiding, debt, or birth into unfree conditions. Enslaved persons performed agricultural labor, domestic work, and craft production under the control of household heads. They lacked legal personhood and were considered property within prevailing legal norms. Archaeological and later textual evidence suggests that enslaved labor was present but not dominant, supplementing rather than replacing free labor within most households. Local governance operated through assemblies that brought together free members of the community. These gatherings functioned as forums for dispute resolution, legal judgment, and collective decision-making. Participation required recognized status and familiarity with customary law, which was transmitted orally. Assemblies reinforced social cohesion by providing predictable mechanisms for resolving conflict without centralized enforcement. Authority emerged from consensus and reputation rather than formal office. Leadership within this system was situational and relational. Certain individuals, often described as chieftains in later sources, exercised influence based on wealth, kin connections, and personal authority. Their power was not absolute and depended on continued support from followers. Leadership roles were reinforced through the ability to mobilize resources, host gatherings, and represent the community in external interactions. These early forms of leadership existed alongside strong traditions of local autonomy. Social bonds were further strengthened through gift exchange and communal feasting. The distribution of goods created obligations and reinforced alliances within and between kin groups. Feasts provided occasions for negotiation, reaffirmation of status, and public display of generosity. Such practices supported social stability by embedding hierarchy within reciprocal relationships rather than coercive structures. These arrangements illustrate a social and political order characterized by decentralization and personal obligation. Authority was dispersed, embedded in households and kin networks rather than centralized institutions. While early pathways toward political consolidation were present, local autonomy remained the defining feature of Scandinavian social organization during this period. The functioning of early Scandinavian society relied heavily on systems of obligation and reciprocity that linked households into broader local communities. These systems operated without permanent administrative structures and depended instead on shared expectations shaped by custom and precedent. Obligations were enforced through reputation, kin pressure, and the threat of exclusion rather than centralized authority. Within this framework, social order was maintained through continuous negotiation rather than fixed hierarchy. Assemblies served as the central institutional expression of this negotiated order. Known in later sources as things, these gatherings occurred at regular intervals and brought together free members of the community. Assemblies were held at designated locations that were often reused over generations, reinforcing continuity and collective memory. Decisions were reached through deliberation and public consensus rather than unilateral command. Legal disputes, land boundaries, inheritance claims, and compensation payments were addressed within this setting. The assembly did not impose law as an abstract system, but interpreted customary norms in response to specific cases. Legal authority rested in shared knowledge rather than written codes. Law was preserved orally, transmitted by individuals recognized for their expertise and memory. These law speakers held influence due to their ability to recall precedent and articulate legal principles accurately. Their role illustrates how authority could exist without formal office or coercive enforcement. Compliance depended on collective recognition rather than institutional sanction. Failure to abide by assembly decisions risked social isolation, loss of support, or escalation of conflict. Chieftainship developed within this decentralized environment as a form of personal leadership rather than territorial rule. Chieftains derived authority from control of resources, success in negotiation, and the ability to maintain loyal followings. Wealth allowed leaders to distribute gifts, host feasts, and support dependents, creating networks of obligation that extended beyond immediate kin. These networks were fluid, requiring constant reinforcement. Leadership could be contested, transferred, or dissolved if support weakened. Military capacity contributed to leadership, but did not define it exclusively. The ability to mobilize armed followers enhanced a chieftain's influence, particularly in intergroup conflict or external interaction. However, coercive power alone was insufficient to sustain authority. Leaders were expected to act as mediators, patrons, and representatives. Failure to uphold these roles undermined legitimacy. This balance limited the concentration of power and preserved a degree of equality among free households. Gift exchange functioned as a central mechanism for maintaining social cohesion within this system. Gifts circulated goods, redistributed surplus, and established enduring obligations. The value of a gift lay not only in its material worth, but in the relationship it created. Acceptance implied recognition of mutual responsibility. Refusal or failure to reciprocate could signal hostility or withdrawal from alliance. Through repeated exchange, social bonds were reinforced and hierarchies expressed without formal stratification. Feasting complemented gift exchange by providing public settings for social negotiation. Communal meals brought together kin groups, allies, and followers in a shared space. Hosting a feast demonstrated a household's capacity to generate surplus and manage labor. Feasts also served as venues for dispute resolution, alliance formation, and reaffirmation of loyalty. Participation reinforced inclusion within the community, while exclusion carried social consequences. These events integrated economic capacity with social authority. Dependents and enslaved individuals were embedded within this structure, but excluded from political participation. Their labor supported surplus production, enabling free households and leaders to engage in exchange and feasting. While lacking legal autonomy, dependents were not entirely disconnected from community norms. Their treatment reflected household reputation and could influence perceptions of leadership legitimacy. Enslaved individuals remained outside the legal community, but contributed materially to its functioning. Over time, these practices created pathways toward greater political coordination without eliminating local autonomy. Repeated alliances, intermarriage among leading families, and consolidation of resource control increased the scale of influence exercised by certain leaders. However, authority remained contingent and relational. No permanent bureaucratic institutions emerged to replace assemblies or household governance during this period. Early Scandinavian social and political organization thus rested on a balance between hierarchy and reciprocity. Power was exercised through relationships rather than imposed through centralized control. This balance allowed flexibility and resilience within diverse environmental conditions while limiting the emergence of rigid stratification. These characteristics define the social landscape within which later political transformations would unfold. The gradual emergence of larger political units in early Scandinavia occurred within the constraints of this decentralized social order. Processes of political consolidation did not replace existing structures, but built upon them incrementally. Leadership expanded through accumulation of alliances rather than territorial conquest in the modern sense. Chieftains increased their influence by extending networks of obligation across wider regions, often through strategic marriage, fosterage, and sustained gift exchange. These methods preserved local autonomy while allowing coordination on a broader scale. Control over key resources played a significant role in this expansion. Access to fertile land, trade routes, or craft production enhanced a leader's capacity to generate surplus. Surplus enabled redistribution, which in turn strengthened loyalty among followers. Leaders who could reliably provide material support during periods of scarcity increased their standing within the community. This relationship between resource control and authority remained indirect, mediated through social expectation rather than formal taxation or administration. Political influence also extended through participation in multiple assemblies. Prominent individuals often appeared at regional gatherings beyond their immediate locality, acting as mediators or advocates. Such participation required recognition by peers and demonstrated broader acceptance of authority. These interactions contributed to the alignment of legal practice and custom across regions without imposing uniform governance. Assemblies remained locally grounded, but shared participation created overlapping spheres of influence. The persistence of localized authority limited the speed and extent of political centralization. Free farmers retained significant autonomy and resisted attempts to impose obligations that exceeded customary norms. Leaders who overreached risked withdrawal of support or open opposition. This resistance functioned as a stabilizing force, preventing abrupt concentration of power. Political change, therefore, occurred through negotiation and gradual adjustment rather than enforced restructuring. Conflict resolution mechanisms further illustrate this balance. Feuds and disputes were common, but regulated through established practices of compensation and mediation. The payment of wergild, or compensation for injury or death, served to restore social equilibrium without resorting to perpetual violence. Assemblies oversaw these processes, reinforcing collective responsibility for maintaining order. Leaders facilitated settlement but did not monopolize authority over justice. This shared responsibility constrained the emergence of coercive institutions. Military organization reflected similar principles. Armed groups were assembled temporarily through personal obligation rather than permanent forces. Participation depended on loyalty, kinship, and expectation of reciprocal support. Leaders coordinated these groups for specific purposes, such as defense or external expeditions, but disbanded them afterward. The absence of standing armies limited sustained coercion and reinforced the episodic nature of political power. Social mobility existed within these structures, though it was constrained by resource access and lineage. Successful accumulation of wealth and alliances allowed certain families to rise in prominence over generations. Conversely, loss of land or followers could result in decline. These shifts occurred within accepted norms and did not disrupt the underlying framework of household autonomy and assembly governance. Political authority remained dynamic and contingent rather than fixed. Over time, repeated patterns of alliance and consolidation created regional centers of influence. These centers did not eliminate local governance, but coordinated it across broader territories. The foundations of later kingdoms can be traced to these processes, though they remained incomplete during much of the Viking Age. Centralization advanced unevenly, shaped by environmental conditions, economic opportunity, and social negotiation. Early Scandinavian social and political organization was therefore characterized by continuity as much as change. Kinship, household autonomy, assemblies, and reciprocal obligation remained central even as political influence expanded. Authority derived from consensus, resource management, and social competence rather than formal office. This system provided flexibility and resilience, allowing societies to adapt without abandoning established norms. The persistence of localized authority ensured that political evolution remained gradual, preserving core social structures while enabling limited consolidation across regions. Religious belief in early Scandinavia formed an integral component of social life rather than a separate institutional system. Pre-Christian religion was not organized around centralized doctrine or uniform ritual practice, but existed as a set of shared cosmological assumptions expressed through local custom. These beliefs developed within agrarian communities whose understanding of the world was shaped by environmental cycles, kinship structures, and inherited tradition. Religious practice was embedded in daily activity and seasonal rhythm, reinforcing continuity between the human, natural, and supernatural spheres. Scandinavian cosmology, as reconstructed from later textual sources and archaeological evidence, reflects a worldview structured around interconnected realms. These realms were understood not as abstract metaphysical spaces, but as extensions of lived experience. The world of humans existed alongside realms associated with divine beings, ancestors, and non-human entities. Boundaries between these realms were permeable, allowing interaction through ritual, sacrifice, and symbolic action. Cosmological narratives explained natural phenomena, social order, and the origins of lineage, situating human communities within a broader cosmic framework. Deities occupied defined roles within this system, each associated with specific domains such as fertility, warfare, law, or weather. Rather than forming a rigid pantheon, divine figures were understood relationally, with their significance varying by region and community. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain deities held prominence in specific areas, reflecting local concerns and environmental conditions. The absence of standardized worship practices indicates that religious expression adapted to local needs rather than adhering to centralized authority. Ritual practice served to maintain balance between humans and the forces believed to influence agricultural success, health, and social stability. Offerings of food, animals, or valuable objects were made to secure favorable outcomes or restore equilibrium after disruption. These rituals were conducted at specific times aligned with agricultural cycles, such as planting and harvest, reinforcing the connection between belief and subsistence. Participation in ritual was communal, strengthening social cohesion and reaffirming shared values. Sacred spaces were defined by use rather than architectural distinction. Natural features such as groves, springs, wetlands, and prominent landscape formations functioned as ritual sites. These locations were selected for their perceived liminal qualities, occupying thresholds between different realms of existence. Archaeological finds of deliberately deposited objects in such contexts support the interpretation of structured ritual activity. The absence of monumental temples in most regions reflects a religious system grounded in landscape rather than built environment. Cultic specialists existed but did not form a professionalized clergy. Individuals recognized for ritual knowledge, healing ability, or divinatory skill held authority derived from reputation and experience. Their roles were situational and often hereditary, embedded within kin networks rather than separate institutions. These specialists mediated between community and divine forces, guiding ritual practice and interpreting signs. Their influence depended on perceived effectiveness rather than formal office. Burial practices provide insight into religious belief through material expression. Treatment of the dead reflected assumptions about the afterlife, social identity, and ongoing relationships between the living and deceased. Both cremation and inhumation were practiced, sometimes within the same region or period. This variation suggests flexibility in belief rather than doctrinal contradiction. The choice of burial method may have reflected status, lineage tradition, or local custom. Grave goods accompanied the dead, indicating continuity between life and death. Weapons, tools, clothing, and personal ornaments were placed with the body or remains, implying belief in an existence beyond death, where such items retained meaning. The selection of grave goods varied by individual, reflecting social role and household wealth. Burial thus functioned as both a religious act and a public statement of identity. Religious belief in early Scandinavia was therefore practical, localized, and adaptive. It provided explanatory frameworks for natural and social phenomena while reinforcing communal bonds. Rather than emphasizing doctrinal consistency, religious practice prioritized continuity, reciprocity, and balance. These characteristics allowed belief systems to persist across generations while accommodating gradual change shaped by environmental and social conditions. Archaeological evidence provides critical insight into ritual behavior and religious expression that cannot be recovered from later textual sources alone. Material remains associated with ritual activity appear across a wide range of contexts, including settlements, burial grounds, and natural environments. These remains indicate that religious practice was not confined to specific locations, but permeated multiple aspects of daily life. The distribution of ritual deposits suggests repeated, structured behavior rather than isolated acts, reflecting shared expectations regarding appropriate interaction with supernatural forces. Wetland deposits form one of the most significant categories of ritual evidence. Objects deliberately placed in bogs, lakes, and rivers include weapons, tools, ornaments, and animal remains. The selection of valuable or symbolically charged items indicates intentional sacrifice rather than disposal. Wetlands were perceived as liminal spaces, occupying a boundary between land and water, life and death. Their use for ritual deposition reflects cosmological assumptions regarding communication with non-human powers. Such practices appear across Scandinavia and predate the Viking Age, demonstrating long-term continuity in ritual behavior. Animal sacrifice also played a central role in religious practice. Archaeological remains of slaughtered animals at specific sites suggest ceremonial killing distinct from routine food production. These sacrifices were often associated with communal gatherings and seasonal observances. The remains of cattle, horses, pigs, and sheep indicate species selection tied to economic and symbolic value. Horse sacrifice, in particular, appears in high-status contexts and is associated with elite ritual display. Consumption of sacrificial animals during feasts integrated religious observance with social redistribution. Built ritual spaces, while less common, are attested archaeologically. Certain structures interpreted as cult buildings or halls contain evidence of repeated ceremonial use, such as deposits of animal bones, weapons, or ritual paraphernalia. These buildings were not temples in a formalized sense, but multifunctional spaces that combined political, social, and religious roles. Their existence suggests that some communities developed focal points for collective ritual activity, particularly where leadership sought to reinforce authority through religious association. Burial practices exhibit both continuity and change over time, reflecting evolving religious and social priorities. Cremation was widely practiced during earlier phases, involving the burning of the body and selected grave goods on a pyre. The remains were then buried in mounds or flat grave. Cremation transformed the body through fire, a process often interpreted as facilitating transition to another state of existence. The visibility of burial mounds served to anchor memory within the landscape, linking ancestors to specific territories. Inhumation burial increased in frequency during later periods, sometimes replacing cremation within the same regions. Bodies were placed intact in grave, often accompanied by goods arranged around the deceased. This practice allowed for greater differentiation in grave presentation and may reflect changing beliefs regarding bodily integrity after death. The coexistence of cremation and inhumation suggests that belief systems accommodated multiple interpretations of the afterlife rather than enforcing uniform doctrine. Grave goods functioned as material expressions of belief and social identity. Weapons, tools, jewelry, and household items accompanied the dead, indicating that social roles continued beyond death. High-status burials contained imported goods, finely crafted objects, and symbols of authority, reinforcing lineage prestige. More modest graves still included personal items, emphasizing individual identity within the community. The variability of burial assemblages reflects both economic differentiation and localized ritual norms. Regional variation is a defining feature of Scandinavian religious practice. Differences in burial construction, grave orientation, and associated objects demonstrate that belief was expressed through locally specific traditions. These variations do not indicate fragmented religion, but rather adaptive expression within shared cosmological frameworks. Communities selected practices that aligned with their environmental context, social structure, and historical experience. Religious practice also intersected with life cycle events beyond death. Rites associated with birth, marriage, and inheritance reinforced continuity between generations. Although direct archaeological evidence for these rituals is limited, their existence is implied by the integration of belief into kinship and household structure. Religious observance supported social stability by providing shared explanations for change and continuity within human life. Through material evidence, it becomes clear that religion in early Scandinavia operated as a system of practice rather than doctrine. Ritual action, repeated over time, sustained relationships between humans, ancestors, and the natural world. Burial practices served not only to honor the dead, but to reaffirm social order among the living. These religious expressions evolved gradually, preserving core assumptions while accommodating shifts in social and economic conditions. Religious practice in early Scandinavia was closely integrated with the rhythms of agricultural and pastoral life. Seasonal cycles structured ritual calendars, aligning communal observance with periods of sowing, growth, harvest, and winter preparation. These cycles reinforced the perception that human prosperity depended on maintaining balance with forces beyond direct control. Ritual actions served to acknowledge this dependence and to stabilize expectations regarding environmental uncertainty. The timing of sacrifices and communal gatherings reflected long-established patterns that connected belief to subsistence. Household-level ritual played a central role alongside communal observance. Offerings made at farmsteads, hearths, or nearby natural features indicate that religious activity was not restricted to public ceremonies. Everyday practices such as food preparation, animal slaughter, and tool use were often accompanied by ritualized gestures or spoken formulas. These acts embedded belief within routine behavior, blurring the distinction between sacred and mundane. Religion functioned as a framework for interpreting daily experience rather than a separate domain of activity. Ancestors occupied a significant position within this framework. Burial mounds and grave markers established enduring physical links between the living and the dead. Placement of grave near settlements or along territorial boundaries reinforced claims to land and lineage continuity. Ancestors were understood to retain influence over the living, offering protection or requiring appeasement. This relationship encouraged maintenance of burial sites and periodic ritual engagement. Ancestor veneration reinforced social stability by anchoring present communities within a remembered past. Material culture associated with burial reflects these assumptions. The inclusion of household objects, tools, and symbols of status indicates belief in continued relevance of social identity after death. The dead were not separated entirely from the living, but repositioned within a different relational sphere. Burial thus marked transition rather than termination. The treatment of the body, whether through cremation or inhumation, expressed different understandings of this transition while maintaining shared assumptions about continuity. The role of religious specialists must be understood within this decentralized context. Individuals recognized for ritual knowledge operated within communities rather than above them. Their authority depended on perceived effectiveness in mediating between human and non-human forces. These specialists conducted sacrifices, interpreted omens, and guided communal observance. Their influence was personal and situational, lacking institutional permanence. Failure to achieve desired outcomes could diminish reputation, reinforcing accountability within the community. Gendered aspects of religious practice appear in both archaeological and later textual evidence. Certain ritual roles and symbolic associations were linked to gendered divisions of labor and social expectation. These distinctions varied regionally and were not uniformly expressed. Women appear prominently in some ritual contexts, particularly those associated with household continuity and divination. Men are more frequently associated with public sacrifice and martial symbolism. These patterns reflect social structure rather than fixed religious doctrine. Over time, religious practice exhibited both continuity and adaptation. New influences entered through contact with neighboring societies, introducing alternative symbols and ritual forms. These elements were selectively integrated rather than wholesale adopted. Core cosmological assumptions persisted, while outward expression shifted in response to changing social and economic conditions. This flexibility allowed religious systems to remain relevant without formal reform. The absence of centralized religious authority facilitated this adaptability. Without fixed doctrine or hierarchy, belief could be reshaped through practice rather than decree. Communities retained agency in determining how rituals were performed and which traditions were emphasized. This decentralized structure supported resilience amid environmental fluctuation and social change. Religious belief in early Scandinavia therefore functioned as a stabilizing force grounded in practice, memory, and landscape. It linked households to ancestors, communities to territory, and human activity to seasonal cycles. Burial practices served as enduring expressions of these connections, materializing belief within the physical environment. Through repetition and adaptation, religious systems maintained coherence while accommodating gradual transformation. These patterns framed social life across generations and provided continuity during periods of change without imposing rigid institutional control. Population movement in early Scandinavia developed gradually from long-standing patterns of mobility rather than sudden expansion. Migration was shaped by demographic balance, environmental limitation, and inherited social structures that regulated access to land and resources. Agricultural productivity across much of Scandinavia remained modest, and viable farmland was unevenly distributed. As households expanded over generations, pressure on available land increased, particularly in regions where inheritance customs discouraged excessive subdivision of farms. Maintaining economically sustainable units required that only a limited number of heirs remain attached to a single holding. This structural constraint produced a surplus population whose prospects within the local agrarian economy were limited. Inheritance practices varied regionally but shared common principles. Land was typically transmitted within kin groups to preserve household viability. Fragmentation of holdings beyond a certain threshold threatened subsistence and social standing. As a result, younger sons, collateral relatives, or individuals without secure inheritance faced reduced opportunities. These conditions did not immediately compel departure, but encouraged strategies that extended beyond local settlement. Temporary mobility, service within other households, or participation in seasonal activities provided partial solutions. Over time, such mobility contributed to familiarity with distant regions and alternative economic possibilities. Maritime environments facilitated this process. Scandinavia's extensive coastlines, navigable rivers, and archipelagos supported routine movement by water. Boats were already integral to fishing, transport, and trade long before sustained migration occurred. Knowledge of currents, winds, and coastal landmarks accumulated through repeated local travel. Maritime mobility therefore represented continuity rather than innovation. When population pressure intensified, these existing skills enabled extension of movement into new zones rather than confinement within saturated landscapes. Migration beyond Scandinavia took multiple forms and must be distinguished analytically. Settlement migration involved the relocation of households or groups with the intention of establishing permanent residence. Such movement required transport of people, livestock, tools, and cultural practice. Archaeological evidence from regions such as the North Atlantic Islands indicates deliberate colonization efforts supported by kin networks and prior reconnaissance. These movements were planned and structured, reflecting long-term commitment rather than episodic activity. By contrast, raiding constituted a different pattern of mobility. Raiding expeditions were temporary and goal-oriented, focused on acquisition of movable wealth, captives, or political leverage. While conducted by similar social actors, raiding did not necessarily involve displacement or settlement. Participation in raiding could supplement household resources or enhance individual status without requiring permanent relocation. Conflation of these forms obscures the diversity of movement and motivation within Scandinavian societies. Expansion into the North Atlantic illustrates the interaction between environmental opportunity and demographic pressure. Islands such as the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland offered land unclaimed by established agrarian systems comparable to those of Scandinavia. Settlement in these regions required adaptation to new ecological conditions, but allowed replication of familiar social structures. The success of these settlements depended on maritime connectivity rather than isolation, maintaining ties to Scandinavian kin networks. Eastern movement followed river systems extending from the Baltic into continental interiors. These routes were already integrated into trade networks linking northern Europe with Byzantine and Islamic economic zones. Scandinavian participation in these systems expanded through incremental engagement rather than abrupt penetration. Mobility along rivers allowed access to markets, service opportunities, and political alliances that did not require abandonment of Scandinavian identity or practice. External pressures also influenced migration decisions. Political consolidation in neighboring regions altered trade access and security conditions. Demand for resources, labor, and military service created incentives for participation beyond local economies. These factors interacted with internal constraints rather than replacing them. Migration emerged as one adaptive response among several, shaped by opportunity, necessity, and accumulated experience. Movement within and beyond Scandinavia therefore reflected structural conditions embedded within agrarian society. Demographic balance, inheritance norms, and environmental limitation established the context in which mobility became viable. Maritime skill transformed constraint into opportunity, enabling expansion without social collapse. These dynamics unfolded gradually, producing patterns of movement that were diverse in form, scale, and intention rather than uniform or inevitable. The distinction between settlement migration and raiding activity becomes clearer when examining material and documentary evidence from regions affected by Scandinavian movement. Permanent settlement left enduring archaeological signatures, including farmsteads, field systems, and burial grounds that reflect long-term occupation. These features indicate the transfer of agrarian practices, household organization, and legal custom rather than transient presence. In contrast, areas primarily affected by raiding display limited Scandinavian material culture, often concentrated in hoards, weapon deposits, or destruction layers without sustained domestic occupation. Migration to the British Isles illustrates the coexistence of these distinct patterns. Initial contact in many regions involved episodic raiding focused on coastal targets and riverine access points. Over time, some areas experienced a shift towards settlement, particularly where political fragmentation or depopulation created opportunity. Archaeological evidence from eastern England and parts of Ireland reveals the establishment of farms, towns, and hybrid material cultures that combined Scandinavian and local elements. These developments reflect adaptation to existing social landscapes rather than wholesale replacement. Settlement migration required negotiation with local populations and adaptation to unfamiliar legal and ecological conditions. In regions with established agrarian systems, Scandinavian settlers often integrated into existing frameworks, modifying land use and social organization incrementally. Intermarriage and cultural exchange contributed to the emergence of mixed communities. Linguistic and material evidence suggests that Scandinavian identity persisted alongside local traditions, producing layered cultural expressions rather than uniform dominance. Eastern movement followed a different trajectory shaped by river-based mobility. Scandinavian groups utilized established waterways connecting the Baltic Sea to inland regions of Eastern Europe. These routes facilitated access to markets and political centers without necessitating large-scale settlement. Archaeological finds along these corridors include trading posts and seasonal camps rather than dense agrarian communities. Such sites functioned as nodes within expansive exchange networks linking Northern Europe with Byzantine and Islamic economies. Participation in these Eastern networks often involved service roles, including mercantile activity and military engagement. Scandinavian individuals entered into arrangements with local rulers, providing armed support or administrative service in exchange for wealth and status. These arrangements did not require permanent relocation of entire households, but relied on individual or group mobility. Material evidence of imported goods in Scandinavian contexts demonstrates the reciprocal nature of these exchanges. External political conditions influenced the scale and direction of movement. The consolidation of power within neighboring regions altered access to trade and imposed new constraints on mobility. Fortification of coastal settlements and regulation of trade routes increased risk associated with raiding while encouraging negotiation and integration. These changes did not eliminate movement, but reshaped its character, favoring settlement and service over opportunistic acquisition. Economic demand beyond Scandinavia also played a role. Markets for raw materials, crafted goods, and labor created incentives for participation in broader systems. Scandinavian communities responded selectively, engaging where opportunities aligned with existing skills and social structures. Migration was therefore adaptive rather than uniform, reflecting calculated responses to shifting conditions rather than uncontrolled expansion. The persistence of ties to Scandinavia remained a defining feature of migration patterns. Settlers maintained communication and exchange with their regions of origin, reinforcing cultural continuity. Goods, ideas, and individuals circulated between homeland and new settlements, preventing isolation. This connectivity allowed migration to function as an extension of Scandinavian society rather than its fragmentation. Through these varied forms, movement beyond Scandinavia remained embedded within familiar social frameworks. Household strategies, kin networks, and customary law continued to shape behavior even in distant regions. Migration did not dissolve social structure, but redistributed it across wider geographic space, maintaining coherence through ongoing interaction. External political and economic developments increasingly shaped the conditions under which Scandinavian mobility occurred. As neighboring regions underwent consolidation, the balance between opportunity and risk shifted. Expanding polities along the North Sea and within continental Europe developed more effective systems of defense and administration. Coastal fortifications, organized military response, and regulated trade reduced the feasibility of opportunistic raiding while creating new contexts for negotiated interaction. These changes altered the incentives associated with movement, encouraging more structured forms of engagement. Economic integration expanded through established trade routes linking Northern Europe with wider commercial systems. Silver, luxury goods, and raw materials circulated through interconnected markets, extending from the Islamic world to Western Europe. Scandinavian participation in these networks was facilitated by maritime and riverine mobility already embedded in local practice. Rather than operating at the margins, Scandinavian traders and intermediaries became integrated participants in existing economic structures. Archaeological evidence of coinage, weights, and standardized trade goods indicates increasing familiarity with external commercial norms. Political service emerged as another avenue of mobility. Scandinavian individuals and groups entered into formal arrangements with foreign rulers, providing military or administrative support. These arrangements offered access to wealth and prestige without requiring territorial displacement of entire communities. Service roles often reinforced social hierarchies upon return, as accumulated resources enhanced standing within local networks. Such mobility demonstrates the flexibility of Scandinavian social structures, capable of absorbing external experience without abandoning internal norms. Environmental pressure continued to influence migration decisions even as external factors grew more prominent. Marginal agricultural conditions persisted in many regions, maintaining incentives for mobility. Climatic fluctuation could exacerbate local scarcity, increasing reliance on external opportunity. Migration therefore functioned as a stabilizing mechanism, redistributing population and resources across wider networks. This redistribution reduced localized stress while preserving household viability. The cumulative effect of these movements reshaped Scandinavian society without undermining its foundational structures. Migration did not result in depopulation of the homeland, but rather extended its social and economic reach. Individuals moved outward and returned, carrying material goods, knowledge, and experience. These exchanges reinforced connectivity rather than fragmentation. The homeland remained a central reference point, anchoring identity and obligation. Over time, patterns of movement became more regulated as political consolidation advanced within Scandinavia itself. Emerging authorities sought to manage external engagement, channeling mobility through formalized routes and agreements. This development did not eliminate migration, but altered its governance. Movement increasingly intersected with political authority, contributing to broader processes of coordination and control. Migration patterns in early Scandinavia thus reflect the interaction of internal constraint and external opportunity. Demographic pressure, inheritance norms, and environmental limitation established conditions for mobility. External political and economic systems shaped its direction and form. Maritime and riverine skill transformed movement into a viable adaptive strategy rather than a disruptive force. Through settlement, service, and exchange, Scandinavian societies expanded their sphere of interaction while maintaining internal coherence. These dynamics illustrate how mobility functioned as an extension of existing social structures rather than a departure from them. Interaction between Scandinavian societies and neighboring regions developed through sustained contact rather than episodic encounter. Long before the period of intensified mobility, Scandinavian communities were already integrated into regional exchange systems linking the Baltic and North Sea worlds. These connections expanded gradually as maritime and riverine routes facilitated regular movement of goods, people, and information. Interaction was shaped by geography, existing trade corridors, and the political structures of adjacent societies, rather than by isolated initiative. The Carolingian world represented one of the most significant zones of contact for Western Scandinavia. Trade routes across the North Sea and along major river systems connected Danish and Norwegian regions with Frankish territories. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the circulation of Carolingian coinage, glassware, weapons, and manufactured goods into Scandinavian contexts. These items appear primarily in high-status settlements and burial assemblages, indicating selective access rather than broad distribution. Exchange was mediated through coastal trading centers and seasonal markets where merchants negotiated access under shifting political conditions. Silver functioned as a central medium within these interactions. Scandinavian societies did not mint coinage during much of this period, but engaged extensively in silver-based economies. Imported coins were frequently cut or weighed rather than used as currency in their original form. Hoards containing Carolingian, Anglo-Saxon, and Islamic silver attest to participation in overlapping economic spheres. Silver served both as a medium of exchange and as a store of value, enabling redistribution within gift economies and facilitating long-distance trade. Trade networks extended beyond material goods to include human movement. The exchange of enslaved individuals formed a component of interaction with external polities. Slavery was embedded within early medieval economic systems across Europe and the Mediterranean. Scandinavian participation reflected integration into existing demand rather than creation of new markets. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that captives were transporting along established routes to regions where labor demand was high. This practice linked Scandinavian mobility to broader systems of exploitation without operating independently from them. Contact with the Byzantine Empire followed eastern river routes connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea. Scandinavian groups entered these regions through gradual expansion of trade and service relationships. Byzantine sources document the presence of northern individuals serving in military and administrative roles. These arrangements were formalized through treaties and contracts rather than informal raiding. Service offered access to wealth, prestige, and political recognition, while embedding Scandinavian participants within imperial structures. Interaction with Islamic polities occurred primarily through trade networks rather than direct political engagement. Silver coins minted in Islamic regions appear in large quantities within Scandinavian hoards, particularly in eastern Sweden. These coins reach Scandinavia through intermediary exchange systems linking river routes, markets, and trading posts. Their presence reflects sustained commercial integration rather than isolated contact. Goods exchanged included raw materials, furs, and enslaved individuals, indicating reciprocal economic relationships shaped by supply and demand. Cultural exchange accompanied economic interaction. Imported goods influenced local craftsmanship, introducing new techniques, styles, and materials. Decorative motifs, metalworking methods, and weighing systems reflect adaptation rather than imitation. Scandinavian artisans incorporated external elements into existing traditions, producing hybrid forms that retained local significance. This selective integration demonstrates agency within exchange rather than passive reception. Diplomatic encounters further structured interaction. Agreements regulating trade, passage, and settlement appear in both archaeological and textual records. These arrangements reflect recognition of Scandinavian groups as political actors capable of negotiation. Diplomacy mitigated conflict while enabling sustained exchange. Even hostile encounters often transitioned into negotiated relationships over time, illustrating the fluid boundary between conflict and cooperation. Interaction with neighboring peoples and empires therefore operated as a reciprocal process. Scandinavian societies influenced external regions through movement, service, and trade, while simultaneously adapting to external economic and political systems. These interactions did not dissolve local structures, but extended them across wider networks. Exchange, negotiation, and adaptation defined contact more consistently than unilateral domination. The mechanisms that sustained interaction between Scandinavian societies and external powers relied on established corridors of movement and communication. Maritime routes across the North Sea and Baltic Sea functioned as connective spaces rather than barriers. Seasonal navigation patterns, shaped by prevailing winds and currents, structured the timing of travel and exchange. These routes linked Scandinavian communities to coastal markets, river mouths, and inland trade networks. Familiarity with these corridors enabled repeated contact, fostering predictability and mutual adaptation among interacting groups. Trading centers emerged as key points of contact. Archaeological sites identified as emporia exhibit dense concentrations of imported goods, craft activity, and evidence of regulated exchange. These centers facilitated interaction by concentrating diverse participants within defined spaces. Merchants, artisans, and intermediaries operated under shared conventions that governed weights, measures, and negotiation. The presence of standardized weights and balances in Scandinavian contexts indicates adoption of external commercial practices adapted to local conditions. Such centers functioned as zones of cultural translation, where foreign and local norms intersected. Mercenary service represents another dimension of sustained interaction. Scandinavian individuals entered the military service of foreign rulers, particularly within the Byzantine Empire. This service was formalized and remunerated, embedding participants within imperial hierarchies. Material evidence, including weapons and dress accessories of foreign origin found in Scandinavian grave, suggests that returning individuals retained markers of service. These items symbolized experience and status rather than assimilation. Mercenary service allowed individuals to accumulate wealth and prestige without severing ties to their communities of origin. Diplomatic engagement accompanied economic and military interaction. Treaties and agreements regulated access to trade routes, established tribute arrangements, and defined boundaries of authority. These agreements appear in both written sources and inferred archaeological patterns, such as the stabilization of trading sites and reduction of conflict indicators. Diplomacy required recognition of mutual interest and capacity for negotiation. Scandinavian groups were not merely subjects of external policy, but active participants shaping the terms of engagement. Cultural exchange operated through multiple channels. Language contact introduced loanwords related to trade, administration, and material culture. These linguistic elements were integrated into North Germanic speech without displacing core structures. Artistic styles also reflect external influence. Decorative motifs found on metalwork, textiles, and stone carvings demonstrate selective adoption of foreign elements. These adaptations were localized, reflecting aesthetic preference and symbolic meaning rather than imitation. Conflict remained a persistent aspect of interaction, but did not define it exclusively. Military encounters occurred alongside trade and diplomacy, often involving the same actors in different roles. Raiding, defense, and alliance were fluid categories shaped by context. Regions experiencing initial hostility frequently transitioned to negotiated coexistence. This pattern underscores the adaptability of interaction and the capacity for recalibration in response to changing conditions. The exchange of knowledge extended beyond material culture. Navigational techniques, military tactics, and administrative practices circulated through contact. Scandinavian communities assimilated external practices where they complemented existing structures. Conversely, external polities adapted to Scandinavian participation by modifying defense strategies and incorporating northern mercenaries into military systems. Interaction, therefore, produced mutual adjustment rather than unilateral influence. Economic demand in external regions shaped the nature of exchange. Markets for silver, luxury goods, and labor influenced Scandinavian participation patterns. Scandinavian suppliers responded selectively, aligning production and mobility with profitable opportunity. This responsiveness demonstrates integration into broader economic systems without loss of local autonomy. Trade functioned as an extension of existing subsistence, and exchange practices rather than a separate sphere. Through sustained interaction, Scandinavian societies became embedded within interconnected political and economic networks spanning Europe and beyond. These networks did not erase local identity, but expanded the scale at which Scandinavian communities operated. Contact with neighboring peoples and empires contributed to gradual transformation by introducing new resources, practices, and relationships. These influences were absorbed through adaptation, reinforcing the resilience and flexibility of Scandinavian social structures. Long-term interaction between Scandinavian societies and external powers produced cumulative effects that reshaped social, economic, and political practice without abrupt rupture. Repeated engagement fostered familiarity with foreign systems of authority, law, and commerce. Scandinavian participants learned to navigate hierarchical institutions, formal contracts, and monetized economies while maintaining their own social frameworks. This dual competence enabled effective participation across cultural boundaries and facilitated sustained exchange. Return movement played a significant role in transmitting external influence. Individuals who traveled for trade, service, or settlement brought back material goods, technical knowledge, and social experience. Imported objects circulating within Scandinavian communities carried symbolic value beyond their practical use. They signaled participation in wider networks and enhanced the status of those who possessed them. Such circulation reinforced internal hierarchies while linking them to external systems of value. External powers also adjusted in response to Scandinavian engagement. Fortification strategies, naval organization, and diplomatic protocols evolved as neighboring regions adapted to sustained contact. The integration of Scandinavian mercenaries into Byzantine and other military forces influenced tactical practice and personnel organization. These adaptations demonstrate that interaction was not one-sided, but involved mutual recalibration of strategies and expectations. Cultural boundaries remained permeable but resilient. Scandinavian communities adopted foreign elements selectively, incorporating them into existing frameworks rather than replacing established norms. This process is visible in material culture, legal practice, and economic organization. External influence was filtered through local priorities and constraints, resulting in hybrid forms that retained recognizable Scandinavian character. Adaptation occurred through practice rather than directive, preserving continuity amid change. Religious and ideological exchange occurred alongside material interaction. Exposure to foreign belief systems introduced alternative cosmological concepts and ritual forms. These ideas entered Scandinavian contexts gradually, often through personal contact rather than formal conversion. Their integration depended on compatibility with existing practices. Early stages of religious change involved coexistence rather than replacement, reflecting the flexibility of decentralized belief systems. Political implications of interaction became increasingly evident over time. Leaders who successfully managed external relationships enhanced their authority within local communities. Access to foreign wealth and recognition strengthened their capacity to mobilize followers and negotiate alliances. External engagement thus contributed to internal differentiation, reinforcing emerging leadership structures. However, authority remained contingent and relational, constrained by customary norms and local autonomy. Economic integration also influenced production and distribution within Scandinavia. Demand for trade goods encouraged specialization and intensified certain forms of production. These changes were incremental and uneven, reflecting regional variation in access and opportunity. Integration into broader markets increased exposure to external fluctuation, but also expanded economic possibilities. Scandinavian communities balanced participation with self-sufficiency, maintaining resilience. The cumulative impact of interaction extended beyond immediate material exchange. It shaped expectations regarding diplomacy, conflict resolution, and social hierarchy. Familiarity with external political models provided reference points for internal organization without dictating outcomes. Scandinavian societies engaged with these models pragmatically, adapting elements that aligned with existing structures. Interaction with neighboring peoples and empires therefore functioned as a catalyst for gradual transformation rather than abrupt change. Exchange, service, and negotiation extended the social horizon of Scandinavian communities while preserving core practices. These processes reinforced connectivity across regions and integrated Scandinavia into wider historical systems. The legacy of interaction is evident in material culture, social organization, and political development, reflecting sustained engagement shaped by mutual influence rather than unilateral dominance. The emergence of larger political units in Scandinavia occurred through prolonged processes of consolidation rather than abrupt transformation. Early forms of authority were rooted in local leadership, kin networks, and assemblies, but over time certain lineages extended influence across wider territories. This expansion was uneven and regionally specific, shaped by environmental conditions, resource distribution, and patterns of external interaction. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden followed distinct trajectories, though they shared underlying structural features derived from earlier social organization. In Denmark, territorial consolidation advanced earlier and more rapidly than in much of Scandinavia. The region's relatively fertile land and geographic compactness supported denser population and greater agricultural surplus. These conditions enabled leaders to mobilize resources more consistently and maintain extended networks of obligation. Archaeological evidence of large fortifications, including ring fortresses, indicates coordinated labor and centralized planning. Such constructions suggest the capacity to command resources beyond local communities, marking a shift toward territorial authority. Law codes provide insight into this process. While written law emerges later, its content reflects earlier customary practices adapted to broader governance. Standardization of legal norms across regions implies increasing coordination among local assemblies. Legal integration reduced conflict between communities and facilitated resource management at larger scales. The articulation of law served both practical and symbolic functions, reinforcing claims to authority and continuity of rule. Norway's path to consolidation was shaped by its fragmented geography. Mountainous terrain and dispersed settlement limited direct territorial control. Authority developed through control of key coastal zones and maritime routes rather than contiguous land. Leaders who dominated access to fjords and harbors exercised influence disproportionate to their territorial base. Control of trade and movement compensated for limited agricultural surplus, enabling consolidation through connectivity rather than density. Royal genealogies preserved in later sources reflect these developments. These genealogies emphasize descent from prominent ancestors, legitimizing authority through lineage continuity. While their historical accuracy varies, they indicate the importance of hereditary claims in emerging political structures. Genealogical narratives linked regional leaders to broader identities, supporting claims to rule beyond local kin groups. In Sweden, consolidation proceeded through control of inland routes and agricultural plains. River systems connecting interior regions to the Baltic Sea facilitated coordination and exchange. Leaders who managed these corridors gained economic and political advantage. Archaeological evidence of central places suggests focal points for administration, ritual, and exchange. These sites supported coordination without fully displacing local autonomy. Overseas expansion occurred alongside internal consolidation. Settlement in Iceland illustrates the replication of Scandinavian social structures in new environments. Migrants established farmsteads, assemblies, and legal systems modeled on familiar practices. Iceland lacked centralized kingship during early settlement, demonstrating that expansion did not necessarily entail hierarchical governance. Instead, it extended existing decentralized systems into new territories. Greenland's settlement further demonstrates the relationship between expansion and resource management. Establishment of farms depended on adaptation to marginal environments and sustained maritime connectivity. Control of trade in walrus ivory and other goods linked Greenland to broader economic networks. These settlements relied on administrative coordination to manage risk and maintain supply lines. In the British Isles, Scandinavian expansion combined settlement and political integration. Control of territory involved negotiation with existing populations and adaptation to local systems. Administrative development occurred through gradual incorporation rather than wholesale replacement. Resource control, particularly of land and trade centers, underpinned authority during peak periods. Territorial consolidation in Scandinavia therefore emerged through interaction of resource management, legal coordination, and lineage legitimacy. Expansion reinforced these processes by extending administrative practice across wider spaces. Authority remained contingent and negotiated, but its scale increased. These developments established the structural foundations for later medieval kingdoms while preserving continuity with earlier social organization. Administrative development accompanied territorial consolidation as leaders sought mechanisms to coordinate resources, obligations, and authority across expanding domains. This process did not involve the immediate replacement of local governance, but introduced additional layers of oversight. Existing assemblies continued to operate, yet their decisions increasingly aligned with regional interests articulated by emerging rulers. Authority was exercised through negotiation with local elites rather than direct imposition, allowing consolidation to proceed without widespread disruption. Fortifications played both practical and symbolic roles in this transformation. Defensive structures protected key routes, settlements, and resource zones while signaling the presence of centralized authority. The construction of large-scale fortresses required mobilization of labor, materials, and logistical planning beyond household or village capacity. These projects indicate increasing administrative coordination and the ability to extract surplus in the form of labor obligation. Fortifications also functioned as centers for storage, administration, and military organization, reinforcing territorial control. Control over resources was fundamental to sustaining expanded authority. Agricultural surplus supported leadership households, followers, and administrative functions. In coastal regions, access to fisheries and maritime trade augmented land-based production. Leaders who regulated access to harbors, markets, or transit points accumulated economic leverage. This leverage translated into political influence through redistribution, patronage, and maintenance of loyal retinues. Resource management thus linked economic capacity to administrative reach. Overseas territories contributed to consolidation by extending resource networks. Settlements in the North Atlantic and British Isles supplied goods unavailable or scarce in Scandinavia. These resources enhanced elite status and strengthened political alliances. Administrative coordination was necessary to manage long-distance exchange, requiring standardized practices and reliable communication. Expansion, therefore, reinforced the development of organizational capacity within Scandinavian polities. Law codes gradually reflected these changes. Standardization of legal procedures across regions facilitated predictable governance and reduced local conflict. While customary law remained orally transmitted, increasing consistency suggests deliberate alignment. Law supported territorial consolidation by defining rights, obligations, and authority across wider populations. Legal integration strengthened claims to rule and reinforced administrative cohesion. Despite these developments, consolidation remained incomplete and contested. Local autonomy persisted and resistance emerged when obligations exceeded accepted norms. Authority depended on maintaining balance between centralized coordination and local participation. Successful rulers navigated this balance, expanding influence without dismantling existing structures. These processes illustrate consolidation as an adaptive extension of earlier systems. Administrative development grew from existing practices rather than replacing them. Territorial expansion intensified coordination while preserving negotiated authority. The result was a flexible political landscape capable of supporting broader influence without uniform centralization. Periods of expansion marked the peak of Scandinavian territorial influence and revealed the operational limits of emerging political units. Expansion was not uniform, but concentrated in regions where administrative capacity and resource control aligned. Leaders extended authority through alliance, settlement, and integration rather than continuous conquest. These strategies reflected practical constraints and reliance on cooperation rather than coercion. Overseas settlements functioned as extensions of Scandinavian social systems. Icelandic governance provides a clear example of decentralized administration operating at scale. Assemblies coordinated legal practice across dispersed settlements without centralized monarchy. This system maintained social order through shared legal norms and collective participation. It demonstrates that expansion did not require hierarchical governance to succeed. Greenland's settlement tested the limits of expansion. Environmental marginality and dependence on long-distance trade imposed constraints on sustainability. Administrative coordination was essential to manage resources and maintain external connections. Failure to adapt to shifting conditions eventually undermined viability. This outcome highlights the relationship between administrative capacity and environmental constraint. In Scandinavia itself, consolidation continued unevenly. Some regions achieved relatively stable territorial authority, while others remained fragmented. Expansion reinforced the prominence of certain lineages and centers, shaping future political development. These processes laid the groundwork for medieval kingdoms by establishing patterns of resource control, legal integration, and administrative coordination. Expansion also intensified interaction with external powers, reinforcing integration into wider systems. Territorial consolidation enhanced capacity to negotiate and defend interests. Conversely, external pressure influenced internal organization. These reciprocal dynamics shaped the trajectory of Scandinavian polities during peak periods. Territorial consolidation and expansion thus represent phases of adaptation rather than culmination. Authority expanded through negotiation, coordination, and resource management. These processes strengthened political structures while preserving elements of earlier decentralization. The resulting polities were capable of sustained influence, but remained responsive to environmental and social limits. Military activity in early Scandinavia developed from existing social and economic structures rather than from permanent professional institutions. Armed force was organized primarily through personal obligation rooted in kinship, alliance, and leadership networks. Free farmers constituted the core of military manpower, providing arms and service when required. Participation in warfare was episodic, shaped by seasonal availability and agricultural demands. This structure limited the duration and scale of military engagement while preserving household viability. Naval capability formed the foundation of Scandinavian military activity. Ship technology evolved gradually from vessels used for fishing, transport, and trade. These ships were adapted for mobility, shallow draft, and rapid landing rather than sustained siege warfare. Naval organization emphasized flexibility and speed, allowing forces to exploit coastal access and river systems. Crews were drawn from local communities and bound by personal ties rather than formal command hierarchy. Leadership depended on reputation and success rather than rank. Raiding represented one form of military activity, but must be distinguished from organized campaigns and territorial defense. Raiding involved temporary expeditions aimed at acquiring movable wealth, captives, or prestige. These expeditions were limited in duration and scope, minimizing disruption to local economies. Success depended on surprise, intelligence, and mobility rather than sustained confrontation. Raiding did not require territorial control and often avoided fortified centers. Organized campaigns emerged in contexts where leaders sought to assert influence beyond local boundaries. Such campaigns involved coordination among multiple groups and required greater logistical planning. Campaigns could include seasonal occupation of territory, enforcement of tribute, or support of allied rulers. These activities required sustained leadership and access to surplus resources. Organized warfare, therefore, reflected higher levels of political coordination than opportunistic raiding. Territorial defense, developed as consolidation, advanced within Scandinavia and neighboring regions. Fortified settlements and defensive structures indicate increasing emphasis on protecting resources and population. Defense required coordination among communities and recognition of shared interest. Naval patrols and lookout systems supplemented fortifications, particularly in coastal regions. Defensive strategies reduced vulnerability to external attack while reinforcing internal authority. Alliances played a central role in military organization. Leaders formed alliances through marriage, gift exchange, and mutual obligation. These alliances facilitated coordinated military response and shared risk. Alliance networks were flexible and could shift in response to changing conditions. Loyalty was contingent on continued benefit and effective leadership. This fluidity limited sustained centralized command but allowed rapid reconfiguration. The evolution of tactics reflected interaction with external military systems. Exposure to organized armies and fortified defenses encouraged adaptation. Scandinavian forces increasingly encountered resistance from consolidated states capable of sustained defense. This resistance altered the cost-benefit balance of military activity, favoring negotiation and integration over repeated conflict. Military activity therefore functioned as one component of broader social strategy rather than an independent institution. Its organization reflected agrarian constraint, personal obligation, and environmental opportunity. As political landscapes changed, these structures encountered limits that shaped subsequent decline. The organization of Scandinavian military forces remained closely tied to social structure and economic capacity. Warfare depended on the ability of households to supply arms, provisions, and manpower without undermining subsistence. Weapons such as spears, shields, and axes were common, while swords and armor required greater material investment and were associated with higher status. Archaeological evidence indicates that armament was unevenly distributed, reflecting social differentiation within military groups. Equipment was typically owned by individuals rather than issued by authorities, reinforcing the personal nature of military obligation. Naval warfare remained the primary means of force projection. Fleets were assembled temporarily, with ships contributed by participating leaders or communities. Coordination relied on shared practice and mutual interest rather than formal command structures. This organization favored rapid mobilization and dispersal but limited capacity for prolonged operations. Fleets were effective in coastal and riverine environments, but less suited to inland campaigns requiring sustained supply lines. Alliances expanded the scale of military action by pooling resources and manpower. These alliances were constructed through negotiation and reinforced by reciprocal obligation. Participation was voluntary and conditional, reflecting the decentralized nature of authority. Leaders who failed to distribute gains equitably risked dissolution of support. Alliance warfare required careful management of expectations and reward. Success strengthened leadership, while failure weakened it. As European polities consolidated, the strategic environment changed. Fortified towns, organized militias, and coordinated defense reduced the effectiveness of surprise attack. Repeated encounters with such defenses increased risk and cost. Military activity increasingly required negotiation, siege capability, and sustained supply, all of which challenged traditional Scandinavian organization. These conditions favored integration into existing power structures rather than independent action. Economic factors further influenced military decline. Expansion of monetized economies altered patterns of wealth accumulation. Trade and service offered more predictable returns than raiding. Participation in established markets reduced reliance on force for acquisition. As trade routes stabilized and regulation increased, opportunities for opportunistic violence diminished. Economic integration thus reduced incentives for independent military activity. Internal consolidation within Scandinavia also reshaped military organization. Emerging rulers sought to regulate armed force, channeling it toward territorial defense and political consolidation. This process reduced autonomous military initiative while increasing coordination. Standing forces began to appear in limited form, altering the balance between household autonomy and centralized authority. These changes did not eliminate conflict, but transformed its character. Warfare became more structured, less episodic, and increasingly tied to political authority. Traditional patterns of raiding and alliance-based warfare encountered structural limits under new conditions. The decline of Scandinavian military activity emerged from cumulative structural change rather than sudden collapse. As external resistance intensified and internal political organization evolved, the conditions that had supported earlier forms of warfare diminished. Consolidated European states developed administrative capacity capable of sustaining permanent defenses, standing forces, and coordinated responses. These systems reduced the strategic advantages of mobility and surprise that had characterized earlier Scandinavian operations. Fortified settlements became increasingly common across northern Europe. Stone walls, earthworks, and garrison towns limited access to resources and reduced vulnerability to rapid attack. Siege warfare required specialized equipment, prolonged supply, and centralized coordination. Such requirements exceeded the capacity of traditional Scandinavian military organization, which remained episodic and dependent on household-based support. As a result, military engagement shifted away from independent action toward negotiated arrangements and service within established powers. Alliance structures also changed under these conditions. The fluid networks that had facilitated rapid coalition building became less effective against centralized opponents. Loyalty based on personal obligation was insufficient to sustain prolonged campaigns. Leaders increasingly relied on formal agreements, tribute, and diplomatic recognition rather than military coercion. These shifts altered the role of warfare within social strategy, reducing its centrality as a means of status acquisition and resource redistribution. Economic transformation further contributed to decline. Expansion of regulated trade networks and monetized exchange systems offered alternatives to military acquisition. Participation in commerce and service provided more stable returns and reduced risk. Scandinavian societies adapted by reallocating labor and investment toward trade, agriculture, and administration. As economic integration deepened, reliance on force diminished. Internal consolidation reinforced these trends. Emerging rulers sought to monopolize legitimate violence, integrating military capacity into territorial governance. Independent raiding and alliance warfare conflicted with efforts to stabilize authority and resource control. Regulation of armed force increased, limiting autonomous initiative. Military activity became an instrument of state formation rather than household strategy. Cultural change accompanied these developments. Exposure to external norms regarding warfare, law, and authority reshaped expectations. Warfare was increasingly framed within legal and political contexts rather than personal obligation. These shifts did not erase martial tradition, but redefined its function within society. The decline of Viking military activity, therefore, reflects transformation rather than disappearance. Military practice adapted to new political and economic realities. As conditions changed, earlier forms lost viability. Scandinavian societies integrated into broader systems, reshaping their relationship with force, authority, and conflict. These processes unfolded gradually, marking the end of one mode of military organization and the emergence of another aligned with evolving political structures. The transition from Viking Age societies to medieval Scandinavian kingdoms occurred through gradual structural transformation rather than abrupt collapse. The social, political, and economic systems that characterized the Viking Age did not disappear suddenly, but were reconfigured as Scandinavian regions became increasingly integrated into broader European frameworks. This process unfolded unevenly across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, shaped by local conditions, external influence, and the cumulative effects of earlier expansion. One of the most significant transformations involved the adoption of Christianity. Christianization proceeded over several generations and varied by region. Initial contact occurred through trade, diplomacy, and service abroad, exposing Scandinavian elites to Christian institutions and ideology. Conversion was often initiated by rulers seeking to enhance legitimacy, stabilize authority, and integrate with neighboring Christian polities. Acceptance of Christianity did not immediately erase existing beliefs, but introduced new religious structures alongside older practices. Over time, ecclesiastical organization replaced localized ritual authority, contributing to administrative centralization. The establishment of churches, bishoprics, and clerical networks altered patterns of governance. Religious institutions introduced written record-keeping, standardized ritual, and hierarchical organization. These developments supported the emergence of centralized authority by providing ideological justification and administrative capacity. Literacy, initially limited, expanded through ecclesiastical use, enabling more consistent documentation of law, property, and lineage. Written communication reduced reliance on oral transmission and facilitated coordination across larger territories. Administrative reform extended beyond religion. Rulers increasingly sought to regulate taxation, landholding, and military obligation. These reforms did not originate independently, but were influenced by models encountered through interaction with European states. Administrative practices were adapted selectively, aligning with existing structures rather than replacing them entirely. Local assemblies persisted, but operated within broader frameworks defined by royal authority. Governance shifted from personal obligation toward institutionalized rule. The decline of distinctive Viking practices occurred within this context of integration. Raiding diminished as political consolidation and economic regulation reduced its viability. Maritime activity continued, but was redirected toward trade and administration rather than episodic violence. Social organization retained elements of earlier kin-based structure, but increasingly recognized royal jurisdiction and ecclesiastical authority. Change was cumulative, reflecting adaptation rather than rupture. Integration into European political systems reshaped external relationships. Scandinavian kingdoms entered diplomatic networks, formed dynastic alliances, and participated in regional conflicts as recognized polities. These interactions reinforced internal consolidation by situating rulers within established hierarchies of authority. External recognition enhanced legitimacy and stabilized borders, reducing incentives for expansion through informal means. This transition also altered cultural expression. Material culture reflects changing priorities, with increased emphasis on Christian symbolism, standardized architecture, and administrative infrastructure. Older forms did not vanish immediately, but were reinterpreted within new frameworks. Continuity persisted alongside transformation, demonstrating the adaptability of Scandinavian societies. The processes underlying this transition reveal that the end of the Viking Age was not defined by collapse, but by reorientation. Social energy previously expressed through expansion and mobility was redirected toward consolidation and governance. These changes were driven by structural integration rather than cultural abandonment. The Viking Age thus ended not through disappearance, but through absorption into evolving medieval systems. Integration into medieval European systems produced long-term changes in language, settlement, and social memory that extended beyond political transformation. Linguistic development reflects this integration clearly. North Germanic languages continued to evolve internally while absorbing external influences through contact with Latin and neighboring vernaculars. Ecclesiastical administration introduced Latin as the language of record, learning, and liturgy. While spoken language remained vernacular, written forms increasingly reflected standardized orthography and administrative usage. This shift altered how language functioned in governance, law, and historical record, without eliminating regional speech variation. Settlement patterns also changed as political authority stabilized. Fortified centers, royal estates, and ecclesiastical sites became focal points within the landscape. These locations concentrated administrative, religious, and economic activity, reducing reliance on dispersed household autonomy. Older settlement patterns persisted in rural areas, but integration into wider systems encouraged infrastructural development such as roads, bridges, and market centers. These changes facilitated predictable movement and exchange under centralized oversight rather than episodic mobility. Landholding practices evolved in response to administrative reform. Documentation of property rights and obligations became more common, formalizing relationships previously governed by custom and memory. This process strengthened elite control over land while clarifying rights and duties for subordinate holders. The integration of written charters altered dispute resolution and inheritance by embedding authority within documented precedent. These developments reinforced territorial stability and reduced reliance on personal negotiation. The historical memory of the Viking Age was shaped by these transformations. As societies transitioned into Christian kingdoms, earlier practices were reinterpreted through new ideological frameworks. Oral tradition persisted, but was increasingly recorded by literate elites whose perspectives reflected contemporary priorities. The portrayal of earlier periods emphasized lineage legitimacy, moral order, and divine sanction. This process shaped later historical narratives, influencing how Viking activity was remembered and classified. The legacy of Viking Age expansion is therefore complex. It includes tangible outcomes such as settlement patterns, linguistic influence, and political boundaries, as well as interpretive frameworks imposed by later societies. Expansion connected Scandinavia to broader historical systems, ensuring that its societies were not peripheral but integrated participants in medieval Europe. The transformation that followed reflects adaptation to these connections rather than retreat from them. Through integration, Scandinavian societies preserved continuity while adopting new forms. The Viking Age became a foundational reference rather than a living system. Its practices informed subsequent development even as they ceased to define contemporary life. This legacy endures through language, law, and historical consciousness, shaped by both experience and reinterpretation. The long-term legacy of Viking Age societies must be understood through their enduring impact on historical structures rather than through the persistence of specific practices. By the later medieval period, Scandinavian kingdoms had become integrated components of European political, religious, and economic systems. This integration reshaped institutions while preserving traces of earlier organization embedded within law, language, and settlement. The Viking Age thus functioned as a formative phase, whose influence extended beyond its chronological boundaries. Linguistic legacy represents one of the most durable outcomes of Viking Age expansion. North Germanic languages continued to evolve into distinct medieval and modern forms, but their influence extended beyond Scandinavia. Scandinavian settlement and interaction left measurable impact on the vocabulary, place names, and grammatical structures of languages in the British Isles and parts of continental Europe. These linguistic traces reflect prolonged coexistence and integration rather than transient contact. Language preserved evidence of social interaction long after political structures changed. Settlement patterns established during the Viking Age also exerted lasting influence. Towns and rural communities founded or expanded during this period often persisted as regional centers. Agricultural practices adapted to new environments in the North Atlantic shaped long-term land use and demographic distribution. Even where settlements were abandoned, such as in Greenland, their material remains contributed to historical understanding of adaptation and limitation. These outcomes illustrate the relationship between expansion, environment, and sustainability. Administrative practices developed during consolidation influenced later governance. Assemblies evolved into formal legal institutions, and customary law informed written codes. The balance between local participation and centralized authority remained a defining feature of Scandinavian political culture. This continuity reflects adaptation rather than replacement, demonstrating how earlier practices were absorbed into emerging state structures. Historical interpretation of the Viking Age has been shaped by the perspectives of later periods. Medieval chroniclers framed earlier activity through religious and moral frameworks aligned with Christian ideology. Modern scholarship has re-examined these narratives, emphasizing structural processes over episodic violence. This reassessment highlights the complexity of Viking Age societies and their integration into broader historical systems. The transition from Viking Age societies to medieval kingdoms therefore represents transformation through continuity. Expansion, interaction, and adaptation produced lasting change without erasing foundational structures. The Viking Age endures as a critical phase in the formation of Scandinavian identity and its place within European history, defined not by collapse, but by integration.